Christmas Day 1888 fell on a Tuesday, and so as far as the newspapers were concerned, it was business as usual, and many of them published Christmas Day editions. The big story with regard to the Whitechapel murders was the murder of Rose Mylett that had occurred in Clark's Yard, Poplar, in the early hours of the 20th of December. There was much debate as to whether her murder was the work of the fiend who by this time was universally known as Jack the Ripper, with the general consensus being that it wasn't. Indeed, several newspapers were stating emphatically that the murder was not by the same hand as those that had taken place over the autumn of the year, whilst at the same time newspapers were commenting that this most recent murder had not, so it seemed, resulted in the same degree of terror and panic that had swept through the area in the aftermath of the previous murders. Christmas Day itself was a rather dull day, both weather-wise and news-wise, and on Thursday the 27th of December, the Western Times looked back on it and published the following report from its London correspondent that had been written on Christmas Day night. London, Tuesday night. Never in the memory of the traditional oldest inhabitant, I should think, has London known a duller and drearier Christmas Day than this. After a gloomy morning, rain began to fall in the afternoon, and tonight it is descending in torrents, while the streets are empty and desolate. Not only is the weather dull, but there is an absolute dearth of news. Inevitably, the Whitechapel murders were still fresh in people's minds, and over the Christmas period of 1888, several newspapers carried mentions of the way that the people of the East End were celebrating the Yuletide that followed their autumn of terror. They were also mentioning the fact that many people in the district were of the belief that the murderer would mark Christmas by committing yet another atrocity. The Aberdeen People's Journal, in its edition of Tuesday, December the 25th, having reported on the weather in London, provided readers with a glimpse of the mood in Whitechapel. Christmas Eve, so far as London is concerned, presented the worst features of an inclement winter's night. The holidays began on Saturday, scarcely a single shop of a representative class being open. The morning of Christmas Eve began in dull, warm weather, and as twilight came down upon the dreary and depressed multitudes, heavy rain added its influence to the prevalent gloom. In Whitechapel, an eerie feeling took hold of the inhabitants, owing to an impression or suspicion or fear that Christmas Day might dawn upon a new horror. The police have naturally relaxed their vigilance, and, in an official sense, the crimes of the autumn have been well nigh forgotten. The poor inhabitants of this benighted region, however, hold Jack the Ripper in a species of superstitious dread, believing that he chooses high holidays and fast days for his murderous forays. In its edition of Thursday the 27th of December, the Western Morning News pondered on how it perceived that Jack the Ripper had spent his Christmas. Jack the Ripper did not spend his Christmas in following the pleasures of using the knife. There was, however, a dire dread that he would gratify his thirst for blood by dispatching another person in Whitechapel. But it was with a sense of relief that one found that he had spent his Christmas in a civilized manner. His barbarism has been traced by some in the Poplar case, but I do not attach any importance to the theories advanced. The Poplar tragedy in no respect resembles those of Whitechapel. Over the streets of the East End of London, it appears that the Christmas spirit was somewhat lacking, if a case reported by the Falkirk Herald in its edition of Saturday, December the 29th, was anything to go by. A serious stabbing affray took place early on Wednesday morning in Dorset Street, Whitechapel, and a labourer named Henry Buckley of 28 Dorset Street is now in custody of the Commercial Street Police on a charge of feloniously wounding. The circumstances of the case are somewhat singular. It would appear that a man named Patrick Manning accompanied a woman in a cab from Euston Road to 37 Dorset Street, and Buckley, who was an acquaintance of the woman, interfered, ultimately it is alleged, drawing a knife and stabbing Manning in the left thigh. The injured man bled profusely and was taken to the London hospital. The wound was found to be of a serious nature, but it is not likely to cause the man's detention for any length of time. Buckley will be brought up at Worship Street. On Saturday the 29th of December, the Warwickshire Advertiser and Leamington Gazette opted to adopt a censorious tone with regard to the people of Whitechapel in a brief article that took a critical look at how they had celebrated the Christmas just gone. The district from which the Whitechapel fiend has drawn his victims was on Wednesday the scene of terrible debauchery which unfortunately characterises that portion of London during this season of the year. The gin palaces were thronged with women reeling under the influence of drink, and the police officers who have been stationed for many years at the east end of the metropolis declare that the terrible series of crimes which have been perpetrated during the present year has had no effect in deterring or softening the women of the unfortunate class who infest certain thoroughfares in Whitechapel. On the contrary, they appear to pursue their calling with as great callousness and brutality as ever. Finally, the Illustrated Police News, in its edition of Saturday the 29th of December, treated its readers to a festive front cover, albeit, given the nature of its readership, a few murders were allowed to creep into the celebrations. And thus the reporting for the Christmas period fizzled out. What is apparent from the newspaper reports is that, although the police had relaxed their activities as the year drew to a close, and the terror and panic that had held the district in its sway since the onset of the murders 4 months before had to a large extent abated, the residents were apprehensive. Even though the anticipated atrocity had not taken place in the early hours of Christmas Day, the people were still nervous about the possibility of the killer's return. And their fears were not without justification, as there would be several more Whitechapel murders throughout 1889 and on to Friday the 13th of February 1891, when Francis Coles became the last victim whose name would feature on the police's Whitechapel murders file. For the residents of the East End of London, the festive period of 1888 was anything but a season of cheer and goodwill.